Imagine being locked away, not behind stone walls but on a ship that never sails. The sea becomes your prison, the waves your only escape, and the horizon a cruel reminder of freedom you'll never reach. In the aftermath of the American War of Independence, 1775 to 1783, the British Empire found itself facing a growing crisis within its borders, a severe overcrowding of prisons. For decades before the war, Britain had relied on transportation as a convenient solution to its criminal population. Thousands of convicts were routinely shipped across the Atlantic to the American colonies, where they served their sentences as indentured laborers. This system not only alleviated pressure on domestic prisons but also provided cheap manpower to Britain's colonial enterprises. However, when the war ended and the newly independent United States refused to accept Britain's prisoners, the system abruptly collapsed. Overnight, the British government lost its main outlet for convicts. Prisons on land were already bursting at the seams, and new inmates continued to flood in at alarming rates. Crime in 18th century Britain was rampant, driven by poverty, unemployment, and rapid urbanization during the early Industrial Revolution. Theft, poaching, and debt could all land someone behind bars. But the reality was that Britain simply did not have enough prisons to hold them. Faced with this unprecedented crisis, the government had to think fast, and cheaply. Building new prisons from scratch would have required enormous funds and years of construction. So, in an act of desperate pragmatism, they turned their eyes to the Thames River, where hundreds of decommissioned naval vessels sat idle, rotting, and unused. These old warships, once symbols of British naval power, were now stripped of their sails and cannons. Their sturdy wooden hulls, however, offered a temporary solution to the prison overcrowding emergency. Thus began one of the darkest chapters in Britain's penal history, the creation of prison hulks or floating prisons. The idea was simple: take an old ship, anchor it near a major port or dockyard, and fill it with convicts. The first such ship, the Justitia, was converted in 1776 and moored on the Thames near Woolwich. Soon more ships followed: Censor, Laurel, Stanislaw, and many others. They quickly became a defining feature of Britain's rivers and harbors, their grim silhouettes a haunting reminder of the empire's growing struggle to contain its own lawbreakers. At first glance, it might have seemed like an efficient solution. These hulks could hold hundreds of prisoners at a time, cost far less than building new facilities, and could even be moved when necessary. But beneath the surface they represented something far more sinister. The ships were not designed for human habitation, especially not for long-term confinement. What were once cramped gun decks and ammunition holds were hastily converted into sleeping quarters. Wooden bunks, barely large enough for a grown man to stretch out, were stacked side by side, often without adequate bedding or ventilation. The British government justified the use of hulks as a temporary measure, insisting they would be used only until more permanent solutions could be established. But as the years went by, this temporary system became entrenched. By the late 1780s, thousands of prisoners were being held on these floating dungeons along the Thames, at Portsmouth, Plymouth, and even as far away as Bermuda. The hulks were guarded by Marines, patrolled constantly to prevent escape, and surrounded by waters that acted as natural barriers. Despite government assurances, conditions aboard the hulks were atrocious from the very beginning. Many of the ships were old and decaying, their wooden hulls leaking and infested with vermin. The prisoners, often men sentenced for petty crimes, were forced to live in filth and darkness. Disease spread rapidly in the damp, unventilated compartments below deck. Typhus, dysentery, smallpox, and tuberculosis claimed countless lives. Official records from the 1780s show horrifying mortality rates, with some ships losing up to one-third of their prisoners within a single year. Even though reformers and officials occasionally inspected the hulks, little changed. The government viewed the inmates as expendable labor rather than as human beings deserving of dignity or care. In fact, one of the advantages of the system in the eyes of authorities was that prisoners could be used for hard labor during the day. They were ferried to the docks or riverbanks each morning under heavy guard, shackled in leg irons, and made to perform back-breaking tasks like dredging the Thames, building fortifications, and repairing naval installations. When the day ended, they were returned to their floating cells, where they slept in chains among the sick and dying. The sight of these ships soon became part of Britain's maritime landscape. Locals in London and other port cities grew accustomed to the eerie image of the hulks anchored offshore, silent, immovable, and grim. Visitors described the stench that drifted from them as unbearable. Reformers like John Howard and Elizabeth Fry began speaking out against the inhumanity of the system, describing the hulks as floating hells and dungeons of despair. But despite growing public unease, the hulks continued to operate, not for a few years but for nearly 80 years. The existence of these floating prisons also reflected a deeper contradiction in British society. On one hand, Britain saw itself as a beacon of civilization, justice, and progress during the Enlightenment era. On the other, it maintained one of the most barbaric penal systems in Europe. The hulks symbolized this moral hypocrisy. Ships that once carried the flag of empire and conquest were now used to confine and punish the empire's own people. By the early 19th century, as Britain resumed transporting convicts, this time to Australia, the number of prison hulks slowly declined. Yet for tens of thousands of men, women, and even children, these ships were their entire world, a world of darkness, chains, and unending misery. They were not meant to sail, yet they carried a heavy human cargo that spoke volumes about how a great empire managed its unwanted and forgotten. The birth of floating prisons was not merely a story of necessity or innovation. It was a story of how desperation, neglect, and moral blindness combined to create one of history's most haunting symbols of punishment, a system adrift at sea both literally and morally. Once a man was sentenced to serve his time on a prison hulk, his fate was sealed in misery. What awaited him was not rehabilitation, but a slow decay of body and spirit. These floating prisons, anchored silently on rivers like the Thames, Medway, and Portsmouth Harbor, were not places of reform. They were warehouses of human suffering where survival itself became a daily struggle. When a new batch of convicts arrived, often in chains and escorted by armed guards, they were led below deck into the dark belly of the ship. The first thing that hit them was the stench, a choking mixture of sweat, rot, bilge water, and disease. The air was so thick that many prisoners fainted upon first entering. The lower decks, once meant to store gunpowder or cannonballs, were now filled with rows of wooden bunks, stacked one atop another like coffins. There was barely enough room to sit up, let alone stretch or move freely. Overcrowding was severe. A space that once housed 100 sailors could now be packed with 300 convicts or more. Prisoners slept shoulder to shoulder, sharing threadbare blankets infested with lice and fleas. Ventilation was minimal, the small portholes barely allowed in a whisper of air. In the summer, the decks turned into furnaces. In winter, freezing drafts cut through the hull, leaving men shivering and sick. Food was another misery. Rations typically consisted of salted meat, hardtack biscuits, and pea soup, all of it often moldy or spoiled. Fresh water was scarce and stored in barrels that quickly became contaminated. Many prisoners resorted to collecting rainwater or drinking the filthy river water that lapped against the ship's hull. Malnutrition was common, and diseases like scurvy spread rapidly. Sanitation was almost non-existent. The ships had no proper toilets. Instead, convicts used buckets that overflowed nightly, filling the decks with an unbearable stench. The bilge, the lowest part of the ship where water and waste collected, became a breeding ground for disease. It wasn't uncommon for prisoners to sleep just above a layer of sewage, the foul air rising through the cracks in the deck boards. The medical conditions were catastrophic. Epidemics of typhus, tuberculosis, cholera, and dysentery swept through the ships, claiming hundreds of lives each year. Corpses were often stored overnight before being taken ashore for burial the next morning. Many convicts never even made it to their supposed sentence's end. Their punishment became a slow, agonizing death at sea. But disease was only part of the torment. The psychological toll of confinement was equally devastating. The endless monotony of imprisonment, the creaking of the wooden hull, and the sound of chains rattling in the darkness created a maddening atmosphere. Prisoners described sleepless nights haunted by the groans of the sick and the cries of the dying. Some men went insane, talking to themselves or lashing out violently at others. Suicides were not uncommon. Men who could no longer bear the misery simply threw themselves overboard, preferring the mercy of the sea to the cruelty of life on the hulk. Daily life followed a brutal routine. At dawn, guards would unlock the hatches, and groups of prisoners were marched ashore in leg irons to perform hard labor. They dredged rivers, repaired docks, loaded cargo, and worked under the unrelenting eyes of armed overseers. The work was physically exhausting, and any sign of weakness could lead to flogging, lashes across the back with a whip that left deep, permanent scars. At sunset, they were ferried back to the ship, chained again and locked below decks until morning. For many, the chains themselves became instruments of torture. Prisoners wore iron shackles around their ankles that rubbed their skin raw, leading to infections. The constant weight of the chains made even basic movements painful. Some men were punished with heavier irons or forced to wear collars to restrict their movement further. Despite the horror, there was a cruel sense of hierarchy and survival among the prisoners. Stronger men dominated the weaker ones, taking the best sleeping spots or hoarding what little food was edible. Violence among inmates was common. Fights broke out over scraps of bread or a stolen blanket. The guards often turned a blind eye unless order completely collapsed. A few prisoners, through good behavior or cooperation, could earn minor privileges such as slightly better rations or lighter labor. Yet even for them, the stench, disease, and hopelessness remained constant companions. Letters from reformers and naval officers of the time reveal the deep despair that pervaded these ships. One British inspector wrote, "The stench is so great that it is impossible to remain below deck for more than a few minutes. The men live worse than beasts, their bodies covered in sores, their spirits utterly broken." Occasionally there were attempts at reform. In the early 19th century, as public outrage grew, the government introduced rules to improve hygiene and reduce overcrowding. Some ships were cleaned more regularly, a few even installed ventilation shafts. But these improvements were minimal and came too late for thousands who had already perished. The system's very foundation, turning old ships into mass prisons, was flawed beyond repair. From the shores of England, these floating prisons looked calm, their sails removed, anchored quietly in the water. But anyone who ventured close enough could hear the sounds that betrayed their true nature, the clang of iron, the coughs of the sick, and the desperate voices echoing from the depths. To nearby townsfolk they became symbols of fear and punishment, to the prisoners inside they were tombs. In truth, life aboard the hulks represented a paradox. The government claimed it was a necessary measure to maintain order and discipline, yet it bred only disease, despair, and death. It was punishment without purpose, suffering without redemption. And for those trapped within these rotting wooden walls, the horizon just beyond their reach was the cruelest sight of all. Freedom lay only a few hundred yards away, but for them, it might as well have been another world. By the late 18th century, Britain's network of floating prisons, or hulks, had evolved into something more than a temporary fix. It had become a crucial link in a much larger system of convict transportation. As domestic overcrowding persisted and the hulks themselves became breeding grounds for death and disease, the British government sought a more permanent solution to rid itself of its growing criminal population. That solution came in the form of penal colonies, most famously in Australia. Transportation had long been a favored punishment in Britain. It was seen as a humane alternative to execution and a practical way to remove undesirable elements from society. Before the American Revolution, tens of thousands of convicts had been sent to the American colonies, where they were sold as indentured servants. But after 1776, with that route closed, Britain was forced to look elsewhere. For nearly a decade, it relied almost entirely on hulks to hold prisoners, a grim waiting room for a destination that did not yet exist. Then, in 1787, the British government launched one of the most significant voyages in its penal history, the First Fleet to Australia. 11 ships carrying more than 700 convicts set sail for the distant shores of New South Wales. The journey marked the beginning of an era that would transform Australia and define Britain's penal strategy for the next 80 years. But before any of those convicts could embark, they spent months, sometimes years, confined aboard the hulks, awaiting their uncertain fate. These ships became temporary holding centers, where prisoners were processed, classified, and prepared for transport. The hulks served as a grim sorting ground between those destined for the colonies and those condemned to serve their time on British soil. Every day, government officials and surgeons inspected the convicts, selecting those deemed fit for the voyage. But fit was a relative term. Many men were half-starved, infected with disease, or physically broken by months of imprisonment. To the authorities, however, they were expendable cargo, bodies to fill ships and populate distant colonies. The process of embarkation was chaotic and dehumanizing. Shackled prisoners were ferried from the hulks to transport ships anchored nearby. They carried with them little more than the clothes on their backs, a few personal items, and the scars of their time on the hulks. For some, the voyage represented a faint glimmer of hope, a chance to escape the stinking darkness of the river prisons. But for many, it was merely a transfer from one form of hell to another. The conditions aboard these long-haul transports were scarcely better than those on the hulks themselves. The convicts were packed into holds below deck, sleeping on narrow wooden bunks, with minimal light and ventilation. The voyage to Australia could take 6 to 8 months, during which disease, hunger, and despair ran rampant. The Second Fleet, launched in 1789, became infamous for its brutality. Of the nearly 1,000 convicts who boarded, over 270 died during the journey, a mortality rate of almost 1 in 3. Those who survived arrived emaciated, sick, and traumatized. News of the horror reached Britain and caused public outrage. Reformers demanded change and the government was forced to act. One of the most significant reforms was the introduction of incentivized contracts for ship captains and surgeons. Instead of being paid for the number of convicts embarked, they were now paid based on the number who arrived alive. This simple shift in policy saved countless lives. Captains now had a financial reason to ensure better food, medical care, and sanitation during the voyage. Conditions improved slightly, though the journey remained perilous. As transportation to Australia expanded, so too did the role of the hulks. They became staging posts not just for convicts awaiting ships, but for administrative processing, medical screening, and even discipline. Prisoners who caused trouble or attempted escape during their time on the hulks were flogged or placed in solitary confinement, often in dark compartments below deck known as the black holes. The hulks thus became both prison and pipeline, channeling Britain's unwanted into a vast penal network that spanned the globe. From the government's perspective, this system had multiple advantages. It reduced the domestic prison population, provided cheap labor in the colonies, and served as a harsh deterrent to potential criminals at home. The message was clear: crime could send you to the farthest corner of the earth, never to return. For the convicts themselves, however, transportation meant permanent exile. Few ever saw their homeland again. Families were torn apart, and those who survived the voyage began new lives in forced servitude thousands of miles from everything they knew. The human cost was immense, yet the system persisted because it served imperial interests. Australia's growing settlements depended heavily on convict labor to build infrastructure, clear land, and sustain early economies. The men and women once chained on the hulks became, ironically, the foundation of a new society. Many convicts, after serving their terms, went on to become free settlers, farmers, and even landowners. Yet their journey began in chains, on the rotting decks of Britain's floating prisons. For the British public, the hulks remained visible reminders of the penal machine that fed the empire. Ships like the Retribution, Bellerophon, and York anchored on the Thames stood as grim symbols of both punishment and imperial expansion. The sight of prisoners being loaded onto transport ships, weak, pale, and in chains, stirred a mixture of fear and fascination. It reinforced the power of the state while hiding the full extent of the suffering behind the facade of justice. Over time, the hulks themselves became obsolete as more efficient prisons were built and transportation routes stabilized. Yet their legacy endured. They were the bridge between the gallows and the colonies, the mechanism through which Britain exported not just its criminals, but its social problems. The men who once languished in their dark holds became unwilling pioneers in a new land, their labor shaping the future of a continent. In the story of convict transportation, the hulks stand as a symbol of transition, from punishment at home to exile abroad, from neglect to exploitation. They were the waiting rooms of empire, floating between despair and the unknown. For those trapped within their wooden walls, every creak of the ship was a reminder that their next voyage might be their last. A journey not toward freedom, but toward another form of captivity, half a world away. While the age of British prison hulks gradually faded into history by the mid-19th century, the concept of floating prisons never entirely disappeared. In the centuries that followed, the idea would resurface again, this time in the modern industrial world, under new names and new justifications. The principle remained eerily familiar. When land-based prisons became overcrowded and budgets ran thin, governments looked once more to the water. And perhaps the most striking example of this modern revival was found not in Britain, but in the United States of America, aboard the Vernon Bain Correctional Center, often called the boat. The story of the Vernon Bain Correctional Center, VCBC, begins in the late 1980s and early 1990s, when New York City was grappling with an unprecedented prison overcrowding crisis. The city's jail population had exploded, fueled by the crack cocaine epidemic, rising crime rates, and aggressive policing strategies under the war on drugs. Traditional correctional facilities like Rikers Island were bursting beyond capacity. Thousands of inmates were awaiting trial, sleeping in hallways or packed into temporary cells. The city was desperate for a solution, fast and cheap. So in 1992, history repeated itself in an unexpected form. The city launched a massive floating jail barge moored in the Bronx, just across from Rikers Island. It was named after Vernon Bain, a beloved warden who had died in the line of duty. But despite the noble name, the vessel's purpose was pragmatic: to house the overflow of inmates that the city's land-based jails could no longer contain. The Vernon Bain Correctional Center was a modern engineering feat compared to the rotting wooden hulks of the 18th century. Stretching 625 feet long and weighing over 47,000 tons, it was designed to hold approximately 800 inmates. Inside, it featured 5 floors of cell blocks, along with facilities that mirrored those of a typical prison. A cafeteria, classrooms, a gymnasium, a chapel, and a library. Its cells were built of reinforced steel, monitored by electronic systems, and patrolled by the New York City Department of Correction. From the outside, it looked like a giant cargo ship, but its purpose was unmistakable. It was a floating jail anchored permanently at the foot of the Bronx. To city officials, the project was a triumph of creativity, a cost-effective and flexible solution that could be moved or dismantled as needed. It was, in their eyes, a symbol of urban adaptability. Yet to critics, the Vernon C. Bain Center was something far darker, a modern echo of the prison hulks that Britain had once used to warehouse its unwanted. Just like those 18th-century ships, the barge was born out of desperation, not compassion. It was meant to contain, not to correct. From the day it opened, the facility faced intense scrutiny. Inmates and former guards described life aboard the boat as isolating and dehumanizing. The cells were cramped and overheated in summer, freezing in winter, and constantly plagued by mechanical failures. Because the barge was surrounded by water, recreation time and movement were far more restricted than in traditional jails. Guards and prisoners alike reported feeling a strange sense of disconnection, as if they were suspended between land and sea, forgotten by the world around them. Despite being marketed as a temporary fix, the barge remained operational for over 3 decades. Over the years, it became a quiet yet persistent symbol of America's struggle with mass incarceration. By the 2010s, the United States had the largest prison population in the world, and the floating prison in the Bronx stood as a haunting reflection of that reality. For some, it was a clever logistical solution. For others, it was a moral failure, proof that society continued to find ways to hide its problems rather than solve them. Former inmates described the atmosphere aboard the Bain Correctional Center as claustrophobic and haunting. The constant rocking of the ship against the current, the hum of machinery, and the echoing clang of steel doors gave the barge a rhythm of confinement all its own. Some prisoners claimed they could feel the boat's gentle sway as they tried to sleep, a subtle reminder that they were trapped on water, close to freedom, yet utterly separated from it. The symbolism was powerful and unsettling. Just as the British hulks had floated off the shores of London centuries earlier, visible reminders of punishment and neglect, the Vernon C. Bain Center floated within sight of the Manhattan skyline, the shining towers of freedom and opportunity standing just across the water from a vessel of despair. Public opinion on the facility remained divided for years. Supporters argued that it provided much-needed relief to an overburdened correctional system. Critics, including human rights groups, condemned it as a relic of outdated punishment philosophy, pointing out that no amount of modern plumbing or electronic surveillance could make a floating prison humane. The American Civil Liberties Union (ACLU) and other advocacy groups highlighted reports of unsanitary conditions, poor medical care, and psychological distress among inmates. By the 2020s, as part of New York City's broader plan to close Rikers Island and reform its jail system, the fate of the Bain Center came under review. In November 2023, the final group of inmates was transferred off the vessel, and the massive barge was officially decommissioned. After 31 years of operation, the world's largest floating prison was finally emptied. Its departure marked not just the end of a facility, but the closing of a historical loop that stretched back more than 2 centuries, from Britain's wooden hulks to America's steel barge. Yet even as the Bain Center's lights went dark, the questions it raised remained. What does it say about modern society that, faced with overcrowding and inefficiency, we continue to turn to isolation rather than rehabilitation? Why does history seem to repeat itself, first as punishment, then as policy? The Vernon C. Bain Correctional Center may have been the last of its kind, but its existence reminds us that the concept of floating prisons, temporary, isolated, and morally ambiguous, is more than just a relic of history. It is a recurring response to a recurring problem. The setting has changed, the materials are stronger, the technology more advanced, but the underlying idea remains hauntingly the same. When we run out of room for the condemned, we simply set them adrift. And so, from the murky waters of the Thames to the industrial harbor of the Bronx, the story of floating prisons comes full circle, a journey through centuries of confinement reflecting not just the evolution of penal systems, but the persistent struggle between justice, necessity, and humanity itself. As the tides of history shifted, floating prisons gradually disappeared from the world's seas, replaced by more structured correctional systems on land. Yet their legacy still lingers, an unsettling reminder of how societies once chose to deal with crime, punishment, and overcrowding. The rusted remains of old hulks, resting beneath harbor waters or preserved in maritime records, tell a story of human suffering and endurance. They expose not only the failures of justice but also the evolving struggle between security and humanity. While modern societies have advanced far beyond the brutal conditions of 18th-century prison ships, the echoes of those dark, confined decks continue to challenge us. They force us to ask difficult questions about how we treat those society deems unworthy of freedom, and whether true reform can ever arise from punishment alone. The story of floating prisons is not merely a chapter of maritime history, it's a mirror reflecting the depths of human cruelty, resilience, and the never-ending quest for justice at sea and on land.